Seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
We got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll.
On board Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. And they were on their way to the moon. Now, we had sent Americans to the moon before, but we'd never put them on the surface. This time, things would be different. And that's why we're here tonight. This is the 45th anniversary of Apollo 11 landing on the moon. I'm Fox from Slooh.com. We'll tell you more about Slooh as we go through the evening. But first, let me introduce our panel. We're joined by Bob Berman. Bob is our Slooh astronomer and the author of a bunch of books, including the latest, Zoom, How Everything Moves. So we're going to be talking with you, Bob, in just a couple of minutes. And also joining us is our observatory director, Paul Cox. If I can just talk back to our producer for a moment, I am getting myself back, and this is incredibly difficult to work through. Also joining us tonight will be Paul Cox. Paul is our observatory director, and he's going to phone. I apologize. I'm going to just ease off right now. He is on the phone. Also, later on, Duncan Copp, who's the award-winning documentary and a noted astronomer, and we'll be speaking live with Andy Chaikin, who, if you're ever looking for a book about the Apollo program, Andrew's written about 85% everything that's ever been about the Apollo program. All right, let's see if this is working now. It's not, but Bob, I'm going to say hello to you anyway. Do you remember where you were 45 years ago tonight? Because I remember where I was.
Yes, I do. I'm afraid to admit it, but I do. What an exciting thing. What was more exciting than our first visit to the moon after thousands of years of planning it? And of course, here it is 45 years later, and some of the secrets of the Apollo program have now come out, things that we really didn't know back then, and we're going to be talking about those during this hour. What an exciting time to be exploring the moon, and I know here at Slooh, we're going to be imaging the moon live as well. Very exciting.
Yeah, we're hoping to get our feed in from our partners at the Dubai Astronomy Group. We'll be looking for that in a little while. Meanwhile, Paul Cox is also with us. Paul, you know, we think of this as a hardware launching a rocket, sending guys out, but there was a lot of astronomy that went into making the Apollo program work, wasn't there?
Actually, there was. By the way, Geoff, I love that really spacey audio that we set up deliberately tonight. I thought that was a fantastic start to this show. Very spacey. Yes, and in fact, I've got, as a Brit, I'm quite proud because our very own Sir Patrick Moore, who very sadly died last year, he did a lot of the lunar mapping of the moon, which helped NASA choose the Apollo sites, Geoff. And the image that we've got up at the moment isn't a live image because it's not a full moon tonight, but this is an image from our half-meter telescope at the Slooh Canary Islands Observatory. And I've marked on it the lunar landing sites, which is pretty cool. And it was, you know, Bob hopefully will be able to tell us a little bit later, exactly the challenges of landing on a surface where nobody knew anything about it beforehand.
Yes, quite right. I'll just give one quick fact now. Nobody knew until we had sent probes there ahead of time whether or not it would even support the weight of a spacecraft. Nobody really knew that it was covered with a thin, fine powder like baby powder, talcum powder. Wound up being an annoying kind of powder because it electrostatically got on everything, all the equipment, the lenses, into the spacecraft. The astronauts breathed it and actually later report that it had kind of a stinky smell to it too. But we'll talk about the moon surface a little later in the show.
All right. Well, this is the night, and this is the night that Apollo 11 landed. That man made his first trip to another body. Bob, tell me a little bit about the site that NASA chose to land on and what we knew about that before we went.
We wanted, of course, to play it safe. The moon has areas that are very rough, and as it turned out, even the area they chose was boulder strewn, and the four legs of the lander could only take a certain amount of tilting. If one of the legs had contacted a fairly sizable boulder, the whole thing would have tipped over. They would have been unable to leave the moon. So they really needed a flat space. And a quick look at the moon, including our live views that we're seeing right now of the moon. This is actually an upside down view, as many telescopes show. Our partner telescope is showing the moon as it looks inverted. In truth, today, this morning, in the wee hours of the morning, as it is in the Middle East and even on the Canary Islands, the moon is lit up on the left, not on the right. But you can still see that there are smooth, dark areas that early observers mistakenly thought were oceans. So we still call them seas, or mare, Latin word for oceans. And so to play it safe, we definitely wanted to land on one of those smoother areas instead of what you can obviously see in this live image, or one of the rougher areas. We tried a rougher area later on in the later Apollo missions. We got bolder, but for Apollo 11, no, we went for as smooth as possible.
All right, Paul, when we look at this, this is, well, tell us about the instrument that's being used to bring us this image right now of the moon.
Yeah, this one actually isn't one of our live images from the Dubai Astronomy Group. That we're going to have those coming into the show a little bit later. This is from the telescope that Slooh members use in the Canary Islands. It's at our Slooh Observatory, and they can control it to image the moon like this or anything else they like, Geoff. So we've got asteroid hunters, comet hunters, and people who actually love just the solar system, the moon and the planets. So that's what we're looking at. This is a 0.5 meter telescope image of the moon, and these are really high resolution. You can zoom in on these, Geoff, as far as you like, and you feel as if you're flying over, just as if you were in the lunar module. It really is fabulous. And of course, Slooh members watch those missions when they set them up live as well.
Excellent. I can see it now. As a matter of fact, the image, is Bob Berman here, that I'm seeing shows us, taken through the Slooh telescopes, that this happens to be, and I'm sure it's no accident, Paul, that you selected this, this happens to be the lighting that was on the moon the day before the astronauts landed. While they were en route to the moon, the terminator, the line separating day from night, was right there, optimally illuminating the tranquility area that the astronauts touched down on. Those blotches on the right, there's a almost circular blotch that's Mare Crisium, the Sea of Crises. Oddly enough, the smooth, dark mare are either named for mental states, emotions, or weather phenomena. So they all have names like the Sea of Rains, the Sea of Storms, or the Sea of Crises, the Sea of Tranquility, the Sea of Serenity. Just those two. Very, very odd combination of nomenclature going on. Yes, Geoff.
You were mentioning before where the Terminator was placed. You had told me once that NASA did that for a really specific reason. They wanted everything to be in place, including where the sun was on the moon.
Definitely, because if the astronauts landed on a part of the moon where the sun was too high, the features would be kind of washed out, and you could not see hidden dangers, boulders, craters, holes in the ground because the sun would be shining too directly down on them. On the other hand, you didn't want to land one day after local sunrise because then the shadows could be so long. Every boulder would cast a long shadow, and then it would hide. The darkness of those shadows could hide other perils, and you couldn't land there either. So they decided that 2 to 3 days after local sunrise would give the perfect, safe lighting conditions, and that's what was chosen for Apollo 11. It turned out to be a fat crescent moon. That was the time.
All right, well, tonight we are having a little help in what we're doing on Slooh, and that is coming from the Dubai Astronomy Group. They are a very active group with all sorts of outreach programs. We're going to try and tell you more about that a little later. But why exactly are we going to be using their equipment as opposed to our own Slooh telescope or our Slooh equipment in the Canaries? Bob?
Well, that's because the Earth is round, and we want to look at the moon tonight during the time of this celebration
Oh,
of the
live
anniversary of
image,
Apollo
gents.
11. And as we see
Live
this
image.
live image of the way the moon looks right now, we need the moon to be up in the sky. It has not yet risen in the Canary Islands, where we have our main observatory, and it's far from having risen in the United States. So we needed to go further east than that, and in Dubai, the moon is up, and here it is.
Jeff, may I just
So,
make a comment on the live
of
image?
course.
You can see on this. So this is the live image coming from the end of the night in Dubai, and that's why this image isn't as crisp and clear as those lovely images that we saw earlier when the moon was far higher up in the sky last month. So the moon is actually getting fairly close to the horizon, and that's why it's not quite as sharp in these live images.
Yes,
Yeah,
quite
and
so.
by the
In
way,
fact, a
what you
crescent
just
moon is
mentioned,
always near the horizon. In our experience, when we think back about it, whenever you've seen a crescent, and the thinner the crescent, the truer this is, a crescent is never high up in the sky. And that's what we have tonight.
all right, as I was going to mention a little bit earlier, and as you saw at the bottom of the screen there a moment ago, if you would like to find out when we have these special Slooh broadcasts, because we're on pretty much anytime there's something important happening in the sky, or anytime like tonight there is an anniversary of an incredible event that had to do with astronomy. We will send you an email. Just go to our website at live.slooh.com. That's live.slooh, SLOOH.com. And of course, we'll send you those free. All right, Paul, is this image that we're looking at from Dubai, is this also an inverted image? And if so, why is that?
This one is, isn't it, Bob? This is north down.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
So all of Slooh's images, Jeff, we make it nice and easy for Slooh members. All of the images that Slooh takes are with north up. But for some reason, actually, Bob might be able to answer this. A lot of planetary and lunar astronomers present their images the opposite way up to everybody else. But it's convention to show it north up. So.
Yes, it's because in space there is no up or down, as we all know, and because observers in Australia, let's say, are upside down anyway compared to us, it's really arbitrary which way we want to show it. But most observers live in the northern hemisphere. That's just the way the world works. And the main observatory of Slooh, not our Chile observatory, but the main observatory is in the northern hemisphere. So to make things match the view that you'd have if you were looking up in the night sky just with your naked eye, Slooh by convention always shows north up. Telescopes naturally flip the image upside down. And so most telescope users say, okay, why not? Let's just leave it. Why not interpose an extra mirror there and flip the image the other way? So as long as we tell you what's going on and the truth and don't hide anything from you, it doesn't really matter. It's arbitrary.
So if we wanted to, could we zoom into that? I see a crater there right near the terminator line. We have that ability to look that deeply. How much did we know about the surface of the moon telescopically before we got there, Bob?
The big surprise that we learned first from our automated remote landers like the Surveyor spacecraft, and then, of course, from the Apollo landings, the biggest surprise was that the moon mountains are so rounded. If you look at any textbook from the 1950s, before we'd sent anything there, all moon mountains were shown pointy, like Mount Everest. That's because there's no air on the moon, there's no wind or erosion, there's no water, there's no reason the mountains should be rounded. Instead, they really rather look like the hills of England or the Catskill Mountains in the eastern United States. They're all hills rather than mountains, even though some are quite tall, 9,000 feet tall, let's say. Nonetheless, it turns out that little tiny meteoroids hitting the moon constantly, since the moon has no air, there's nothing to stop these small specks from constantly bombarding the moon. They've acted like little hammers of the god Thor, hammering and hammering and hammering the surface and rounding everything.
So it's erosion.
Yes, it's a form of erosion that is alien to us here on Earth, but that was a big shock to us.
I
And
think
the other
that's
shock,
Jeff,
yeah.
Jeff,
Yes,
maybe if
go.
I can ask Bob another related question on that. It was still in the 60s, wasn't it, where we didn't really know whether these craters we were seeing were volcanic or through impact. Because I know Patrick
Quite.
Moore, certainly he was a great advocate of them being volcanic.
That's right, and he was wrong.
He
They're
was.
all caused by even though there was volcanism on the moon in the distant past, there had to have been because those are lava seas, so those dark areas, such as the Mare Tranquillitatis, the Sea of Tranquility, is just really frozen lava. So there had to have been volcanoes a long, long ago, but all traces of them are quite gone, and the craters are all from meteor impacts. And another big surprise, but this one we learned in 1959 when the first Russian spacecraft went to the far side, is what the far side looks like. We assume that the moon's two hemispheres, the one that faces us and the one that we never see from Earth, looked more or less the same. But for all we knew for sure, maybe the moon was a half shell and there were just 2x4s holding up a half shell, a facade. We didn't know for sure what the other side looked like. We assumed it would look like the side that faces us. And as usual, we were wrong. We were totally wrong. The hemisphere, the opposite hemisphere, where, by the way, none of the Apollo spacecraft ever landed. They all landed on the side of the moon that faces us. The side that faces away from us is an alien world, totally different. It doesn't have these mare, these seas, these areas of frozen lava, far greater craters, far more mountains, far rougher terrain. It's like a completely different world.
And is that because of the tidal influence of the Earth on the moon? I mean,
Yeah,
I
we
know I'm
think
throwing
so.
you a curveball here.
Yeah, no, exactly. Why should one side have all this volcanism and the other doesn't? Another clue is that the exact center of the moon by mass is a mile closer to Earth than it is on the other side. That doesn't amount to too much. The moon is 2,160 miles across, so a mile isn't much. But nonetheless, the moon is weighted in our direction. And you're right. That's exactly why we influence it. If you think the moon affects us, you know how people think about births and lunacy, and certainly the rising in oceans, which are mostly caused by the moon, the tides on Earth. Well, the Earth is 81 times heavier than the moon. So our tides on the moon are 81 times greater than the moon's tides on Earth. So you bet we influence the moon.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but let me try anyway. We're on the same day of the year, and we're looking at the moon, but the moon is not the way it was in 1969. I know seasons match up. Why doesn't the moon match up?
Well, because the moon's orbit around us doesn't match with our calendar months. Our calendar months are 30 or 31 days long, if I understood your question correctly. But the lunar time it takes to go around us is 27.32166 days. That obviously doesn't match up to our calendar at all. So a given date in any one year, we'll see a different phase than you will have on that same calendar date the next month or the next year. The only weird, strange coincidence is that the exact number of lunations, that's lunar phases from full moon to full moon or from half moon to half moon, matches a woman's time between conception and birth, so that whatever the phase of the moon was when you were conceived, Geoff, that is most probably the same phase that the moon exhibited when you were born.
Where's the Twilight Zone music when we need it?
That's what we need right now.
So let me ask you two, or let me start with you, Paul. As an astronomer, is there a place on the moon that you wish that they would have gone, something that you've seen on the moon that fascinates you that we have not explored?
Well, I have to just say that I am an amateur astronomer, and I'm very proud to be one, as most Slooh members are. Bob's a professional astronomer around here, but I do happen to know that over the last few years, we've been learning a great deal more about the moon. And I think looking at those, if we can get back that lunar map showing where all of the Apollo landing sites were, it would have been great if they'd been able to go to one of the poles that get very little sunlight, and we're pretty sure that there's quite a lot of water there. And wouldn't it have been great to actually have eyes on that? But I think not just where they landed, but I would have liked to have seen more scientists visit the moon. Bob
Yes,
can
only
maybe tell
only
us.
Harrison. That's right. Only Harrison Schmitt in the final Apollo 17,
Absolutely,
was a
the geologist.
trained geologist. It would have been good to have some more. But as long as
And
you
But
put
did
this
they
up,
cut the
Paul,
program short? I mean, the program was cut short, wasn't it?
yes, it was cut short for two reasons. The final three Apollos were canceled. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. There were two reasons for that. One is political. Richard Nixon really didn't love the Apollo program. Throughout it, he had to grin and bear it while his old nemesis, the now dead John F. Kennedy, who narrowly beat him in the 1960 election, was getting all the credit. Actually, justly so, because it was Kennedy who made the famous "We'll go to the moon by the end of the decade" speech. And so now we're talking about in 1969, everybody was invoking Kennedy, and Nixon just had to kind of sit there and take that. But the other reason was a good reason. As Apollo 13 demonstrated, these were risky missions. Every one of them was perilous. And Apollo 13, the astronauts almost didn't make it back. So people were starting to figure, not the people at NASA, because they wanted to keep going. There was still more to learn. But the reasoning in political circles was, hey, we've already sent 12 people to the moon surface. 6 successful missions have landed on the moon. Why should we just keep doing this until someone gets killed and gives the whole program a black eye and leaves us with a bad taste in our mouth? Shouldn't we just quit while we're ahead? And that's what they did. They quit after Apollo 17 so that we could finish up with a perfect safety record.
Well, this is Slooh.com's special broadcast on the 45th anniversary of Apollo 11. It was 45 years ago tonight that Apollo 11 put Americans on the moon. We've got more coming up, including Bob's interview with Duncan Copp, who is an award-winning documentary producer and astronomer, and more, of course, on Apollo 11. We will be back in 30 seconds.
I think, if I'm honest, the one thing that I sort of came away with, having been involved in the film, was just how audacious it was, just how incredible it was that 45 years ago, which is some time ago now, we actually went to the moon. I think
All right, we're back, and we're going to be joining Bob in an interview that he did in just a minute. I do want to remind you that the reason that we're here tonight is because of Slooh.com. Slooh is the community observatory. We maintain 2 observatories with 3 telescopes on 2 continents in 2 hemispheres. Slooh members guide the telescope on each of its nightly missions. Each individually guides it, and all our Slooh members can watch and participate and even set the agenda on what we're going to see. In fact, one of our participants tonight, Paul Cox, is our Slooh Observatory Director. Paul, what kind of things have people been looking at recently from our telescopes?
Oh, we've had some real doozies lately. They have been superb. We've got some fantastic comets at the moment, one of which is going to be hitting the headlines hugely in October when it makes a very, very close approach to Mars. That's Comet A1 Siding Springs. That's only visible from the southern hemisphere, so our Chile observatory is ideally placed for that. But we've had a supernova hunter. We've had another.
For
Go
just
on.
a second. Okay, we have a lot of people who are watching this and are saying, you know, I look in the sky, I like looking at the stars. I think I'd like to know more about astronomy. Now this guy is on, he's talking about the hemispheres. It's how advanced or how knowledgeable do you have to be able to use what Slooh has?
You just have to have an interest in astronomy, Geoff. We will then take you in, we'll take you into this lovely kind of community that we've got, which is both self-supporting, and we're adding more and more content to it to take people through, to handhold them through what can be an incredibly daunting subject. But right from the beginning, you don't know what the moon is, you don't know where it orbits, you don't know that it's 4.6 billion years old. It doesn't matter. We'll teach you all of that and more. And you do it in this community, Geoff, and it's so self-supporting. It's, you know, you're with others learning. It's a fantastic environment to learn in. You know, it's not like a school classroom. You can hear it. I get enthusiastic when I talk about, you know, teaching astronomy, and yeah.
All right. Well, let me get Bob back in here. Speaking of getting excited, when we talked about the fact that we were going to have Duncan Cobb on, you got excited. So tell me why and introduce your interview.
Oh, well, Duncan's just a great guy and a very modest fellow. He's a planetary expert. I believe his PhD thesis was on Venus. And yet, if you ask him, are you a professional astronomer? He'll say, oh, no, I'm a filmmaker. I'm a documentary filmmaker, which is true enough. But gee, where I come from, if you have a doctorate in planetary astronomy and astrophysics, you're an astronomer. So he knows what he's talking about. And the stuff he's done and the documentaries have been fascinating. I have a copy myself of one of them, and it's great. He hails from Britain, and as long as you can understand a British accent, it's always fun to talk to Duncan.
All right, let's take a look.
Slooh astronomer Bob Berman here, and it's my pleasure to bring on board a periodic visitor to Slooh, Dr. Duncan Copp. Duncan is both an astronomer, but is probably better known as producer of the award-winning film In the Shadow of the Moon. And of course, on this, the 45th anniversary of the first landing on the moon, the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Can you believe it's been 45 years? Whoa, where does the time go? But because you were so involved in that, interviewing astronauts and really getting involved, I have to ask you, during the process of producing this documentary, how did your own perspective on the moon evolve and change, and what did that do to you as a professional astronomer?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think, if I'm honest, the one thing that I sort of came away with, having been involved in the film, was just how audacious it was, just how incredible it was that 45 years ago, which is some time ago now, we actually went to the moon. As I sort of got involved in the research and started meeting and talking with some of the astronauts and other people who've made that happen, you suddenly realise just how incredible that task was. So it's quite easy to sort of say, oh yes, you know, men walked on the moon and what an incredible achievement it was. But drilling down into it and really understanding what was required and what was necessary to make that mission successful. I think it's Mike Collins, who was the Apollo 11 command module pilot. He was the chap who stayed in orbit around the moon while Neil and Buzz went down to the surface. Said, You know, it's a very delicate daisy chain of events that had to happen. And if it broke anywhere, that's it. It's useless. It's done. So every single thing had to happen, and it had to work. And I think actually the odds were about 50-50 that they would actually land on the surface. I think the odds were put at about 50-50. So it was incredible. And the more you get to talk to these people, the more you realize that A, they actually did it, and B, what an amazing feat it was.
That's right. Now, when you produced the documentary, there was a soundtrack, a soaring musical score. And it struck me, since I own it, I'm so glad to own the DVD, is that, well, of course, space is silent. When there were the actual, right, the commands for mission control, there was no sound. So how do you decide to add music to what's inherently a silent enterprise? And were you happy with it?
I was delighted. I mean, we were very fortunate to have a fantastic composer on board, and that's Philip Shepherd. And we'd not worked together before. And we'd actually heard some of his music. And we cut a trailer for In the Shadow of the Moon to show to the commissioning editors. And we used his music. And it worked so well. I remember turning to the director and saying, you know, this music's wonderful. We should really get in contact with Philip. And I gave him a call and I sort of said, look, we've got this project. Is it something you'd be interested in? And he basically bit my hand off, you know, which was wonderful. And from that moment onwards, was absolutely engaged and on board with our film. And his music, his score, was a seminal part of the film. Really, really important part of putting everything together. And he drew his inspiration from lots of different sources, but one of the things he told me about that helped him were the romantic names of the seas on the surface of the moon. Of course, there's no water on the surface of the moon, but these are the ancient oceans and names of the ancient features. And he drew inspiration from that. I think he found that really quite romantic. And Phil builds soundscapes. That's one of his trademarks. It's something he's he's a phenomenally good musician, phenomenally good cellist, but he builds these wonderful soundscapes. And if you listen very carefully, what he actually did is he started to sample some of the downlink noises. Bob, you picked up on the fact that, you know, there's not a lot of noise going on in space with these missions, but there are little beeps and little crackles and little bits of static, and he took those elements and he either sped them up or slowed them down, or and wove them into his soundtrack. So a bit like Alan Bean, the Apollo 12 astronaut, when he paints the moon, he actually puts a little bit of his moon dust that he's got left over into his paintings. Phil did the same thing with the soundtrack. He added a little bit of that sort of downlink beep that you can hear, and it's wonderful. It's very evocative, and really his music was organic. I mean, it was very much a process of us talking, but basically he was able to interpret and put his own feeling into that music, and it worked incredibly well. We were very happy with Phil's work, definitely.
Fascinating. If I were there, and probably you as well, the soundtrack would have been more like screams of terror and worry as we were descending close to the moon's surface, rather than mere crackles and static on the radio. So they did well. Speaking of which, your newer project, which is very exciting, is Moon Machines. And these are, of course, the devices that got us there, starting with the Saturn V rocket, the equipment that got us there.
Yeah, certainly. So Moon Machines tumbled out of In the Shadow of the Moon. We'd spoken with the astronauts who went to the moon, and then we thought it would be just wonderful if we could make a series which then shone a very bright light on the people who had worked so hard to put those men on the moon. So effectively what we had to do is we had to go and search for these engineers. And we had 6 programs in all, and very loosely we follow a chronology. So we start off with the Saturn V rocket, which gets you into orbit, and then we have a program on the command module, and then navigation, because that's what's required to get us to the moon. That was program number 3, and then we go through to the lunar module, gets us down on the surface, the spacesuit, of course, that's what you're going to need if you're going to step outside, and lastly, the lunar rover. And so we tracked down as many of the engineers that we could find who had worked on that program, on the Apollo program. And that was a big task because there were so many. Some of them we couldn't track down. Some of them didn't want to be part of the program. Some of them did. So eventually, with regards to the stories, with regards to the narrative that we wanted to tell, we handpicked and approached the people that we wanted to take part in that documentary series. And I tell you, it was fascinating. It was talking to the astronauts is incredible. Talking to the engineers is unbelievable. What they had to go through.
And Duncan, of all the bits of equipment that got us to the moon, the J1 engines, the F1 engines, the lunar LEM, is there a particular technology that makes you shake your head in awe and disbelief more than any other, or is it all part of? I know 500,000 people worked on this for 10 years, so it was equivalent to building the Great Wall of China. What stands out in your mind?
That's a really tough question to answer, Bob, because you know as well as I do, every single bit of every single machine had to work. I think the lunar module is an incredible flying machine. It looks like nothing you've seen before, obviously, because it doesn't have to be aerodynamic in space. But I think one of the most difficult things with the lunar module is the sheer difficulty they had in having to reduce the weight of the lunar module. So the engineers worked incredibly hard to save every ounce, because that had a knock-on effect with the rest of the machinery that got men to the moon.
This has been fascinating, as it always is, Duncan. I do want to mention that in collaboration with NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we're talking about JPL, and you, award-winning producer-director Duncan Copp, love this guy, and the Houston Symphony now has commissioned a film of the latest high-definition planetary images to accompany its live performance of Gustav Holst's suite, The Planet. So you can buy the app. You can visit HoustonSymphonyApps.org. So good luck with that. Everything you do is amazing, Duncan, and it's always a pleasure to have you on Slooh. So thanks for joining us on this historic occasion of the 45th anniversary of. And
okay, coming up in a couple of more minutes.
What better person?
Coming up in a couple of more minutes from he has some Apollo 11 stories. Also, Andy Chaikin, speaking of Apollo, a true Apollo expert and author of just a bunch of books on the Apollo program. He'll be here as well, but we'll be right back on Slooh in about 30 seconds. And we're back on Slooh. Okay, I am joined by our observatory director, Paul Cox, who must be on some sort of witness protection plan because we can't get him on camera tonight. But Paul, I want to talk to you a little bit about Slooh. And let me just back up here for a half second. For those of you joining us tonight and seeing our programming here on Apollo 11 and the 45th anniversary, Slooh is an organization that is very interested in anything that's going on in the sky. We are the community observatory, and we have available to our members 2 observatories with 3 telescopes run by this fine Mr. Cox man with the British accent. Paul, tell me a little bit about how our members get the pictures that they want with the Slooh telescope and get those pictures back to their own computer?
Well, it's very simple. It can seem really complicated just owning a telescope, but we make it really, really simple. So from the comfort of your own home with a mediocre internet connection, which is all I get in England, you just point the telescopes wherever you want at a designated time, and the telescopes automatically take the images, build color images with these incredibly expensive CCD cameras, which are special cameras that astronomers use. And those are processed in real time, Geoff, and streamed back to your desktop computer, just in your browser. But if you can't stay up all night, then you can also just set it up to just auto snap, what we call auto snap, the images that you've set up. Well,
If you're not,
well, think of me in the UK with our Canary Islands Observatory. Well, when the Canary Islands Observatory is dark, it's also dark for me. So occasionally I do go to bed. So the telescopes are operating when I'm in bed. But for people in North and South America, obviously they're far better time to watch the missions live. But if you can't do that, then you can use the auto snap feature, and you go into your system in the morning and you have your own collection area where all of those images land up, Geoff. And members share them in what we call the Clubhouse. We've also started, actually, you probably saw in the Clubhouse, we started last week a Slooh picture of the day, where we're highlighting some of the most beautiful and stunning images that members capture.
all right. Well, we put up there before, and we will again before we're finished, our offer, which is 3 months so you can sort of get your feet wet and see if Slooh is for you, and 3 months for the price of one. All right. Bob Berman is with us. He is our Slooh astronomer and teller of tales. Is that okay? You're an author. You have 8 books. How many books have you written? I'm gonna 8.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so you are a teller of tales, but you have some good Apollo 11 stories, things that I guess a lot of people don't know. And I've been told to ask you specifically about the Buzz Aldrin story.
Well, yeah, I did spend an hour chatting with Buzz Aldrin, but for one of my books, which was about the space program, I interviewed a number of astronauts, and amazing stuff that the public still doesn't know about that historic mission and about others that are worth telling. And yeah, okay, I'll share. I'll share just a few. First of all, in that first one, it's pretty well known that as Neil Armstrong was settling down to the moon, he came awfully close to running out of fuel. In the background, you can hear the Houston mission controller responsible for monitoring the fuel saying 45 seconds, and then a little later saying 30 seconds. And all this time, Armstrong was near the surface, but he saw a lot of boulders in front of him, and his rockets on the LEM were kicking up dust. He couldn't see clearly, but it didn't look like a safe place. So he kept skidding sideways. This was a lot of good piloting on his part, good pilotage, until he found what looked like a clear area. Now, we've got less than 30 seconds left. So now he started lowering it until a blue light came on his panel. Now, that bright blue light meant that he was supposed to kill the engine at that point and let the LEM just simply drop the last few feet. If he had done that, it was designed so that the honeycombed aluminum legs would crumple just enough so that the ladder on the side of the LEM would be a few comfortable feet from the surface. He did not do that. Neil Armstrong was just too good of a pilot. He couldn't bring himself to just let it drop. So he flew it gently, using the last bit of his fuel, by the way, flew it gently to the surface, so gently that the legs never crumpled as they were designed to do, and the ladder remained high up. And that's why when he stepped out a while later, he was so darn high in the air because the ladder just was nowhere near the surface. And it was also in shadow, by the way, so he had to jump down into darkness. And when he, that was quite a bit of a one step for a man. Now, 19 minutes later, when Buzz Aldrin stepped out, this was a funny thing. First thing that happened, his first words were, "Well, I'm out of the LEM. I'm going to leave the door here. I'm leaving the door partially open, making sure that it doesn't close and lock behind me." And Armstrong said, "A good thought." And those of us who are watching at that point, listening to this, we're saying, "Is that even possible? Is this a comedy routine? Could they lock themselves out?" But in any case, then Buzz Aldrin was warned by Armstrong. He said, "You've got 3 steps down the ladder and then a long one." So Buzz Aldrin had to do that. He had to jump down. And because this thing was so high in the air, he hit the lunar surface so hard that the urine bag in his boot broke. So suddenly his shoe was filled with pee. Now he had a live mic and he knew it. So he did not say a word, but his time on the surface could have been characterized as one small squish for a man, and every step that he made, they were just squishes on the moon's surface. So that's one story that's seldom told or little known about the moon mission. Shall I go on? You want to hear more?
I'll take a short one. I don't know if you know what a short one is, but I'll take a short one, Bob.
Okay, it says here in my paper,
Tell me a
10 minutes.
30-second story.
30-second story. All right. In that case, I'll just mention the fact that at the White House's insistence, President Nixon's name, Richard Nixon, and his signature were on every single plaque on all of the Apollo landers. Now, his was the only name that repeated, that kept repeating on the moon. And because there's no erosion or air or rain on the moon, these should be legible for at least 500,000 years, maybe 1,000,000 years, probably long after there's no human race. So what is the only name that repeats if aliens ever come to the moon and find these words and can decipher it, that will outlive the human race itself, is Richard Nixon.
Great.
Is that short enough?
That was very good. We have a guest that I'm going to bring on, Bob. He is a noted author of just a handful of books on the Apollo program, an Apollo expert. He will be a guest on CNN's incredible documentary, which is called The 60s. It's a documentary series that they've been running on Thursday nights. He's Andy Chaikin, and we will have him on right after we come back from this. I'm feeling good. All right, we're joined. I was just saying I'm feeling good. We're joined by Andy Chaikin. Andy, well, you are pretty much 85% of the published works on the Apollo program. You have a bookshelf's worth of volumes on Apollo.
True.
What?
Gross exaggeration, but thank you anyway, Geoff.
But you do have a distinction that I think is extremely cool. You have spoken to each of the 12 men, each of the 12 Americans who has been to the surface of the moon. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. That is true. I interviewed them all, as well as all but one of the command module pilots. Jack Swigert was no longer living. I interviewed 23 out of the 24 astronauts who went to the moon when I wrote my book, A Man on the Moon.
And how, Andy, are these guys different than me?
Well, other than the fact that they've been to the moon, Geoff.
Well, no, I mean, what is it that makes someone special to be the kind of guy who would have been brought into the Apollo program?
Right. No, I was just trying to collect my thoughts as I provide mindless chatter back to you. I would say we're talking about overachievers. We're talking about people who could perform at a level of high competence under remarkable stress. I mean, these are people who could remain calm in a jet airplane that was about to go haywire or was going haywire. These are people who could ride a rocket and still do everything that they needed to do to carry out their mission. You know, these were people with tremendous drive and intelligence. Um, there are there are lots of people like that on the planet, and but these were the cream of the crop of military test pilots at the time when NASA was looking for military test pilots and fighter pilots to fly Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions. So they had already gone through some um, pretty strenuous wickets, some pretty demanding wickets, if you will, to get to the point where they could even be selected as astronauts. And so we're talking about a very rarefied group of individuals just by virtue not only of their personal traits, but what they had already managed to accomplish in their lives as pilots.
I mean, these guys were going into a situation where they knew that death wasn't just a possibility. It was a strong possibility, and it was a mission, Apollo, where you could even get killed training, as the astronauts in Apollo 1 were killed in
Yeah.
that horrific fire. So when these guys went, I know that Richard Nixon had prepared this speech, "Should our men be lost?" What did the astronauts in NASA do? Did these guys go and just push it out of their minds?
You know, that's one of the most fascinating things that came up when I was talking to them. And I remember talking to both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin about the possibility that the engine would not fire to get them off the moon when it came time to lift off and rejoin their crewmate Mike Collins in lunar orbit. And if that engine didn't light, you know, they were doomed. And you know, I thought it was very interesting. Even those two men, you know, Buzz's reply to me was, "Look, everything had been stacked in our favor. Everything had been figured out to the last detail and made as reliable as humanly possible. Why should I assume that the worst would happen when so much had been done to make it more likely that we would succeed?" So he he did not feel any anxiety about it, um, and you know, certainly not at the time of the mission. And then I talked to Neil about it, and I knew that Neil had requested that the engineers develop a extra backup method for starting the engine manually, but just by opening some valves. They were not able to do that in time for Apollo 11. They had it on later missions. And Neil confirmed that he had tried to make that happen before the flight. I think once they were on the surface, you don't assume that something bad is going to happen. If you're preoccupied with that, you're really not in the right line of work. And that's pretty much how they all felt.
So they were up there for 8 days and change in a very, very small space. I mean, as small as the space shuttle was, that they were really jammed in. Were there ever any
Yeah,
personality conflicts or fights in space?
not that I know of. There were definitely differing personalities on some of those missions. I mean, in particular on Apollo 14, if you think about Al Shepard and Ed Mitchell, they were pretty different in their personalities. You know, Al was pretty much standard issue fighter jock, test pilot, and Ed was also a test pilot, but had a much more intellectual streak, was much more introverted, um, had an interest in ESP even before he flew to the moon. But they got along fine. You know, in the context of the mission, you know, you're there to do the mission.
So who was it who said, "Neil, you're going to be the guy. You're going to make the first step on the moon"? And how did that make him seem in the eyes of all the others who obviously wanted exactly the same thing?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that it could have been a number of different astronauts who ended up taking the first step on the moon because, you know, if things had not gone well with Apollo 8 or 9 or 10, then 11 would not have been the first landing. And in fact, in the astronaut office, most people were betting on Apollo 12, which would have made Pete Conrad the first guy on the moon. But
Yeah, just to put this in historical context, people don't remember, before we landed a man on the moon, we sent astronauts just to orbit the moon.
To orbit the moon and to then orbit the moon with the lander as well as the mothership and carry out a dress rehearsal. So the first orbital flight around the moon was Apollo 8. Then they tested the entire Apollo spacecraft in Earth orbit on Apollo 9. Then they did that whole road show in orbit around the moon. And these were incredibly demanding and complex missions, and something could have gone wrong at any point. So it was not a done deal by any stretch that Apollo 11 would actually be assigned to do the first landing. But every one of those preliminary flights, Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10, were perfect, pretty much perfect. And so
Andrew,
that meant that Neil was going to be commanding the first landing. And as the commander, he got out of the lunar module first.
Andy, I'm going to apologize to you now if something that you don't even know is happening, but under you, your name has been wrong this whole time. So let me just make sure everybody knows that is Andy Chaikin, who is coming to us from Vermont this evening on the 45th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11. I know Bob Berman, our Slooh astronomer, has a few things. There you go. Now we've got your name correct.
I'm not too far away from Bob Berman, and I hope we get to cross paths in real physical space, not just cyberspace.
Yeah,
Bob,
I've often said that
a couple
too.
of things you wanted to ask. Yeah, go ahead.
That's right, and I feel the same way that Andy does. We have friends in common. We've said, "Oh, you got to meet Andy. He's such a great guy," and I have been an admirer of his writing for many years. So yeah, Andy, I hope we see each other. Yeah.
Right back at
you. So what is your question, Geoff?
I said I thought you had questions for Andy.
Oh no, this is all just fun stuff. This talking about the moon missions. I've spoken to not nearly as many astronauts as Andy has, but in speaking to some, elaborating on something he said about the personalities, because he mentioned Apollo 14 and the very disparate personalities of the ESP experiments on the moon, bizarre ESP experiments, unauthorized, by the way, done by Edgar Mitchell, as if he were Edgar Casey or something. But there's a very different feeling in the different crews. To answer your first question, Geoff, for example, the Apollo 11 people were very professional, but they were not friends. There was no warmth. There was no camaraderie. Neil Armstrong later spoke of maybe having a reunion, but they never did. Now, you'd think they would have been bonded by this experience, that they would have gotten together, but that never happened. And that was in sharp contrast to the next Apollo, the Apollo 12 with Pete Conrad and Alan Bean. They were buddies from the beginning. They were warmth. There was laughter, and in fact, when lightning hit that spacecraft on the way up, there ended up being just crazy giggling. It was I mean, Alan Bean was just giggling and giggling. Maybe it was just relief afterward. But this was an odd thing, as Andy knows very well, that after lightning hit them, after they were checked out, there was some serious concern about whether the parachute system would have been damaged. And Bean was asked about that years later, and he said, well, the people at Mission Control told us that they didn't know if the parachutes would open or not. They didn't know if it were damaged, and they debated, well, we don't know the condition. Should we bring them down? And the consensus was, well, why do it? After they go to the moon and have their adventures and do their science, then more than a week from now, the parachutes are either going to open or they're not going to open. And we're going to find out then. At least if we let them do it, they will have lived 10 days longer. If we bring them back down now, what's the advantage of that? So there's a lot of different things happening on these missions. It's a lot of fun.
A lot of scary stuff. Andy, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I want to mention that you are actually a part of the 60s documentary. Tom Hanks produced 60s documentary series that's on CNN, you're going to be on not next week, but the week after this one?
You know more than I do at this point. It was supposed to be on this past Thursday, and I was thinking maybe they'd just bump everything 1 week, but maybe you're right.
Probably.
Maybe it'll be on in 2 weeks.
I don't know, but it will be. You know what? The series, I don't know if you've watched it, really well worth seeing. It's very well done, from what I remember, from what I was told of the 60s.
One little piece of it, but thanks.
All right. Well, okay. And thank you, Bob Berman, our Slooh astronomer, for joining us tonight. And also Paul Cox, our Slooh Observatory Director. Again, these broadcasts, which happen anytime there's something going on in the sky, or that we can celebrate a special event like tonight, the 45th anniversary of Apollo 11. Slooh gets on the air. We'd like you to know about them. So go and sign up, and we will give you alerts at live.slooh.com. And check out Slooh. We are the community observatory. We have 2 observatories with 3 telescopes on 2 continents and 2 hemispheres. If you have too much city light or not enough room, or you're interested in astronomy and you don't want to make the huge investment that you would have to make to be really well equipped, then maybe Slooh is for you. Our members set the agenda individually. You will tell the telescope where to point, and then the imagery will be provided for you. You'll find out more on our website. It's slooh.com. Always glad to answer questions. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you back on the air, I believe in a week. I'll be here, whether you will or not. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.